that you also should do just as I have done to you. And so looking to this example, particular in this passage, we want to look at what is this example that Jesus is giving, the perfect example, in order for us to follow. And we see it in the context of his final week and his final time with his disciples. Do you guys remember growing up and playing Simon Says? You guys remember playing? Would you guys indulge me and we could play a little game of Simon Says together? You guys know how all this works, right? And this is probably one of those moments where everyone sits and says, where is he going with this? But here, just bear with me. Simon Says, so when Simon says to do something, you do this. And you know, Facebook has kind of an advantage because everyone is not going to see the ones that are on Facebook, and they can raise their hands, wave them around like they just don't care. And we don't even know if they're doing what Simon says or not. And but all of us, just kind of keep your minds or your eyes up here towards me, not looking, so nobody is embarrassed. You don't have to participate. You don't have to participate. You can just sit and watch. But this is mostly for my entertainment right now, that we're going to do this. And so Simon Says, wave your left hand. Yeah, very good. Oh, we got good participation. That's good. Simon Says, wave your right hand. All right, put your hands down. Oh, it was a good majority. I feel like just moved. All right, so we're still, Simon didn't say move our hands. So Simon Says, put your hands down. All right, now let's do something. This will create kind of a cool effect, I guess, here in our midst. So everyone on my left, your right, Simon Says, tap your knees. All right. And then everyone on my right and your left, Simon Says, snap your fingers. You close your eyes. Simon Says, close your eyes right now, and you can just imagine the rain falling on the pitter patter. And Simon Says, stop. Beautiful, wonderful, wonderful. I think there's something in the Simon Says game that we can kind of look and use as an analogy whenever we think about doing as Jesus has taught us, following the example that Jesus has given. Many times our approach to the New Testament and what Jesus says is that we want to look and we say, we have to follow the words that he says. We have to listen and be obedient to the words that he says. So it's Jesus says, do this, and this is something that we want to be about, and we want to listen carefully to that. But, as we played the game of Simon Says, a part of it is that visual, right? A part of the visual, and whenever I say put your hands down, and then half of you put your hands down, and half of you don't put your hands down, and because Simon didn't say that, you're what many of you are doing, you're following the example instead of listening to the words. But both of those are important. When we look at what Christ says in the New Testament and the Gospels, and we look at what Christ does, both of them are important for us to look into. Both of them are important for us to watch carefully and to see, are the words that he's saying and the example that he's setting, how does that fit together? Because many times there can be some things that could be seeming contradictions or paradoxes of you call me to do this, but then and then you do that. You call us to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, yet you go and you heal on the Sabbath. And so there are the example of Jesus healing and the call of God to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, and how that has been interpreted and understood over the years. And so you've got this contrast, and so you're looking to see how does that example fit together with the words that are said in order for us to follow what Christ has shown us. I think this is a very important exercise for us when we're thinking of incarnational ministry, when we're thinking of being Christ or ministering God's grace to the people that are around us. It is important for us to take this example as a whole, not just the words that are on the page, not just the actions that we see taking place, but putting those together in a way that we say this is a meaningful way for us to interact with one another and a meaningful way for us to interact with our community in a way that reflects the example just as Christ has given us. The example that he gives us in this passage, what John is recording here and what Jesus says, this is my example, you follow it, is the example of what how the disciples and Jesus are to interact together, how we are to respond to leadership, how we are to be leaders, and also what it looks like to be a servant leader, and where our confidence needs to be. All of those things are within this example. If we listen closely and if we watch closely, we will see the examples, some of what to do, what not to do, but we'll see the example coming together of what Christ is giving us. So let's walk together just through some of these first verses, and I'll just explain it as we walk through and take away some of these things of how we follow Christ's example. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now, just that first verse gives us the context. It gives us the time. Jesus is looking at the last 24, 48 hours of his life. Jesus is looking, and when it says his hour had come, if you remember last week when we looked at Jesus turning water into wine, that was one of his statements to Mary was, my hour has not yet come. Why are you bothering me with this? My hour has not yet come. Because in John's gospel, whenever it talks about his hour coming, that is speaking of his time of giving of his life, of dying on the cross. So he knows the pain, he knows the suffering, he knows the difficulty, he knows the things that are kind of laying out in front of him, and this is the time that he is to lay his life down for his people. And it shows his love for those that he was entrusted with as he was there with his disciples. And so looking at that, the Passover, they've gathered together, they're celebrating, remembering how God has delivered his people through out of the land of Egypt, out of the time of slavery, providing the Passover lamb in order for them to be saved and safe passage and then into the promised land eventually. So this time of Passover is a time of remembering and celebrating what God has done. And what Jesus is looking at in contrast is he's saying, my hour has come. I am that lamb. I am the one who is provided. I am the one who has come in order to make my people whole. And so there's a contrast of what is going on, because probably the disciples didn't quite understand what was going on. I mean, they seem, through most of this dialogue and time, they seem pretty oblivious to even the explicit things that Jesus says. I'm going to the cross. I will not be here anymore. That kind of thing. And they still seem kind of confused when it all happens. And so that's the context. That's the time frame. But what I want you to see in the beginning is the example that Jesus sets in this. He knows, so you got the contrast of the celebration on one side, and you've got the knowing that Jesus is going to the cross on the other side, and also knowing that one who had been of the 12, Judas, was going to betray him. He knew that one that he loved was going to stab him in the back. And that was coming. So not only the suffering of the cross, but the breaking of relationship. I mean, there's just so much here for Jesus to push back on, to say, oh, this is going to be a rough road. But what he does and his approach, I think, gives us a picture even of our approach, whether in good times or bad times, no matter the circumstances. How do we approach one another? So it carries on. It says, during supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God, he was going back to God, rose from supper, he laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So just, take in this whole moment of what Jesus knows, because we look back in retrospect, What Jesus knows is he's going to the cross. He is facing his own death. He is facing the betrayal of one of the ones that he's washing their feet. And in that midst of celebration, he wants to set this example. And he has such utter confidence in the plan of the Father that he is not distracted away from what needs to happen. He is not distracted, and what he does is, with resolve, he kneels down and he serves those that he loves. If you think about that in terms of our own processing, and when we're faced with difficulty, we're not walking the road of the cross necessarily, but when we're faced with difficult circumstances and things, people stab us in the back, and difficulties are occurring, relationships are breaking, and things are strained, our reaction is generally not, who can I serve? Who can I lift above myself during this difficulty in order to see them move forward? Even in the impending difficulties that are going on around, how can I help the whole move forward knowing what I have to face? It's counterintuitive. But what Jesus knows that many times we forget is that God's plan is going to work out in life and in death. It's one of those unique features of Christianity that says we can have hope and walk through suffering with promise of the hope that is in Christ Jesus. With the promise that God's plan will be worked out and unfolding, we can have confidence in him in the stepping forward so that we can too carry this heart of service. But it takes confidence in God's plan. So he continues on, and we see as he begins to wipe or wash the disciples' feet, we see his encounter with Simon Peter. That's always entertaining, right? Every time Simon Peter pops up, it's an entertaining thing. Simon Peter, the one that walks on water and also fell in the water, right? You got the same things happening, but he's just this ball of passion that is just excited about what, and he's going to go to the extreme of whatever is facing him and whatever's in front of him. And so Jesus comes around and is washing the disciples' feet. And it says, he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? And Jesus answered him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. Peter said to him, and keep in mind too, he knows that Peter will deny him later, right? He talks about that in around this whole time of their time in the Passover. He knows that this is going to happen. Yet he is going to serve. You don't understand what's going on now, but there will be a time when you will understand a little bit more. Wash your feet. And Jesus answered, if I do not wash you, you have no share in me. And right there, Jesus kind of draws the line of mutual submission within the context of love and the disciples and who Jesus is. Jesus is basically saying, if you're not going to let me serve you and you're not going to be served, this doesn't work. This idea of me being your teacher and you being my disciple, it doesn't work if you don't allow me to serve you just as I'm calling you to serve others. There's a picture here of God's love that many times we miss because Peter is pushing back, and that's our natural inclination. In someone is trying to serve us, we push back. The picture of what Jesus is doing is showing us the example of service. I think that might be the easy part of what Jesus' example is here, because I think we generally have a generous heart. The people in the mountain community, and we produced 15 cords of wood yesterday in 3.5 hours with however many volunteers that we had coming together, 30 some volunteers, and we are a kind, generous people willing to serve one another when we know that it is going to be something that is going to be beneficial, right? We had this idea of service, but receiving the service that comes our way, that is a difficult one. And Peter here is struggling with that idea that in the picture of following Jesus' example, there is a picture of mutual submission between the two that is within this example that many times we can miss. So he says, you have no share. If you don't understand the way that this is going to work between the two of us, that you have to receive my service, even if you're serving and working with me. And Simon Peter says, and here's where he goes to the extreme, Lord, not only my feet, but let's take a whole shower. Let's turn this into a bathhouse, right? And it's just like he just goes all the way to the side. And Jesus said, no, you're not getting it. You don't understand. Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? Right? He said, I have never brought Chris Tucker out. Anyway, so Jesus says, the one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. For he knew that one was to betray him, and that he said, not all of you are clean. And so the picture of service, the example that Jesus gives, is a picture not just of serving others, but it is a picture of mutual submission. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Secker, back in the 1700s, wrote this about types of servants. And maybe, listen to this and say, where do I see myself? Because I think we'll see both Peter and Jesus in the way that he breaks this down. He says this, God has three sorts of servants in the world. Some are slaves, and they serve from fear. Many people look and they say, you know what, I am called to serve Jesus, and you know what, if I don't, I'm afraid of what's going to happen. I'm afraid that God is going to come get me. And if I don't serve, if I don't do these things just right, I'm afraid of the wrath of God. And that's a picture of a driving factor in many people's lives, and their motivation to serve comes just out of a heart of fear. And then he says there's another type of servant, and this is like hirelings that serve for wages. So I'm going to serve in order that I feel better, in order that I get something in return. If I serve you, I'm going to receive some blessing in a backdoor kind of a way, and so it works in a self-serving kind of a way, that we are giving and helping others in order that we feel better about ourselves. Do you hear the twistedness in that? Do you hear the brokenness in that? And in what Peter is saying here, you hear those things that no, Jesus, you're not going to, he's afraid to have Jesus serve him. He's afraid of doing, there's a fear factor within this. But then when he realizes, oh, if I can't have some part of this, then sure, yeah, wash the whole thing, and so then he begins to think almost completely self-serving. Well, if it's going to have to come, then let's wash the whole thing, right? And so you see that. But then this quote says this. It says there's one other, and that is the servant who is like a son or a child who serves because they love. Service out of love. Mutual submission together out of love for God and for others is the driving mentality and posture that Jesus is giving in this example. Confidence completely that the Father has things ordered and put together. My circumstances will not stand in my way. But as I approach others, my approach is to serve out of love. Just later in this chapter, Jesus gives to his disciples in 34-35, he says, I give to you a new commandment, that is to love one another. And he goes on and he says, this is the defining factor of you as a disciple. If you want the world to know that you belong to me, the way in which they will know is with your love for one another. Not because you're afraid of what's going to happen, not because you want to make sure that you have your fire insurance paid up and that you're good for the rest of eternity. It's genuine, self-giving, mutually submissive love that comes from God. So he continues. So when he had washed their feet and put on the outer garment and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." And here's the important part of where, if we just simply say Jesus says, then this turns into a sacrament. Washing feet, and some churches have done that. Some churches have turned foot washing ceremonies into a sacramental quality thing, that this is what Jesus is calling you to do, you and I to do, that we are to participate together. And nothing wrong with that symbolism that is in there, but I think the thrust of what Jesus is saying here is supposed to come out not just in the words that he's speaking, but in the actions that he's taking. And he's giving us a whole picture of what we are to follow. He says, "For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you." Having full confidence in the plan of God the Father, you submit yourselves to each other, serving one another out of love, not of fear, not for what you're going to get out of it, but simply serving one another out of love. And doing that for those that are around you. This is the true way of leadership. This is the true posture of God's people, to be his disciple. This is what it looks like. And he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who has sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." So what I call us to in this picture of what Jesus has given us, the example that he has shown us, the words that he has spoken, is that we take a posture of submitting to one another, of mutual submission together out of love for God, first and foremost, that he has things under control, and that we care and love for one another. That's the posture that I call for Josh, who's here thinking about becoming an elder. Anyone else that would become an elder in future times. That is the posture that we have to take as the leaders of this church, to say that we are putting ourselves under the church in order to serve, in order to lift and advance the cause of what Christ has done. Not because we're out in front and isolated, but because we are serving and moving things forward from underneath. Servanthood sets the example as worth following, because the concern of the servant is in others advancing together, not in one moving forward in isolation. Jesus was moving forward God's plan. He was following firmly what the Father had set out for him. But the way in which he was leading that was by putting himself on the floor, washing his disciples' feet, and letting them know that they will be the ones that will be carrying things forward. And as they carry things forward, they don't need to just carry the mantle and pull hard, but they need to get with God's people, support them, show them his grace, show them his gospel, in order to see his kingdom advance. Here's what I hope. I don't want people to see CCC, Conifer Community Church, come up with a great plan for this community. And what we're going to talk about in the annual meeting and all those things, I don't want people to look and say, you know what, CCC has a great plan for this community. Here's what I want them to see in consistency with what we're called to be and do as God's people and his servants. I want them to look and I want them to say, Conifer Community Church is participating in God's plan for this community. A subtle difference of us submitting ourselves to what God is calling us to do, not just what we think is best. This is the thrust of how we move forward, serving one another and serving our God with all of our hearts. I want to invite you to bow your heads and close your eyes and think about and pray about these two things. One, just personally inside of you, what circumstances are you facing in life that are exciting? What circumstances are you facing in life that are difficult? And are you looking past the circumstances to see God's plan? That's what I want. Direct your prayer to say, God, I want to see your plan and follow your way. First prayer. Second prayer. So I want you to consider where God is leading us as a church and how we are serving one another out of love. And ask God to give us the eyes to see and the heart to understand and the willingness to follow our servant leader in Christ. Lord God, we ask for your guidance. We ask for your blessing. We ask for your word, and Lord, that we would follow your example, not just the words that you say, not just the things that you do, but God, the whole picture of how you want to advance your kingdom. Lord, I pray that we would serve one another in that process, lifting one another up. In your name, amen.